Interestingly, we're having this conversation on what would you say have been the strengths. 1 year, like you said, is a foundational year for every government. But foundational stones are also very important stones in every structure that you have. And for instance, if you cannot talk about reforming without having the mind that change will happen. So I love the fact that this is a result-oriented, it started with result-oriented performance appraisal system. For the first time, we are hearing that the government wants to benchmark itself.
Yes, with KPI.
Their ministries and a whole lot of all that. Coming from my background, I would like to say that that is a very way to go. We've agitated for that many years in coming. And then you looked at it again, it's like there's nothing you really can do without capital. And most times, these discussions in the past have always been about how much money government has spent. And then all that goes there. So when you talk about governance, you're beginning to talk about accountability. You're beginning to talk about transparency. You're beginning to talk about even starting with availability. And I love the fact that revenue generation in this government has been interesting. You remember about the time His Excellency took over, it was about 976 million, right? And then immediately after he takes over, allocation to states went to the tune of about 1.1 million. It has been consistent. And you see, that consistency for me is the first place to start. That number one, allocation of allocation to states and the rest of them. It's not in any way hampered in the past. Before you hear it fluctuates, it nosedive, and that for me is the first set of governance. That you're not going to govern in a vacuum. You're going to do your bit. Why is that important? Because almost everything that every level of government has to do, education, for instance, is funded. Education is in concurrent budget. Everybody has their role to play. So if in the past you were not funding, speaking about state level, you're not funding education at secondary education level because you have no funds and because what comes from the federal is not there and you're not. But what accountability in the instance of this government, availability of resources from the federal, which has been, is that you've actually set the stage for, can we now monitor ourselves? If you said input is not part of the problem, then can we begin to go to an output and a result-based kind of performance appraisal, and not just appraising the federal at this instance. I think it's also getting the feedback from each of the individual states that if the federal is not owing you any kind of allocation, and if it has increased because of the removal of subsidies, as the case would have been, then we would have a conversation with every tier of government to say. And another part of this governance that we're talking about is the fact that local government administration has always been an issue. I know on the APC Professionals Forum, we've always had this conversation and this debate. You know, the government looks at itself from inside, because you cannot, if you're governing, you are saying that at this point in time, if I am ruling, I don't care what you do. But what I have seen in this government is what people would say, government is reversing itself. But no, government is listening to the people. For instance, you remember the cyber security levy that everybody screamed about? So when you have a government that is governing, the government is getting feedback, a sense of this is government of the people, for the people, and by the people. So I need you to come into the platform with me. And I think this government has listened. There's also this conversation about what has not been working. I think the controversial Lawrence Sawyer report in its implementation is also another part that says, over the years, he didn't initiate that report. But over the years, there's been a lot of shying away from what it's more like who wants to bail the cat in what appears to be very difficult. And within this 1 year, we see that courage to engage this issue that has to be, number one, again, is the proliferation of too many institutions. And then even though there's a bit of conversation on whether the amended proposal, especially as relates to secondary education, which is very touchy for those of us in the education stakeholder, that federal have always subsidized every tier of education, but secondary education has not been one of those tiers. And so you will want to say that there's maybe needs to relook into some of those areas, because Secondary Education Commission should stay. There's been debates for and against, but most of the debate has favored that as much as we want to implement some of those ones, there are some others we want to take with a pinch of salt to ensure streamlining. So if you ask me, the elements of governance, like you would want to say, is a governing system would want to ensure that certain structures are in place. And within this year, we might not say we are there yet, but it's for a foundational year, these are bold things to begin to look about that we could say that this is...
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for